Well, thank you, Roger. It's great to be back. so, uh, I think it was a little over a year ago, I was standing on this stage, leaving as a librarian of the Philosophical Society, heading down south for a brief foray to George Washington's Mount Vernon as the director of their presidential library. And I stood on this stage, and I see Linda with Linda, and I said being librarian of the society was maybe the greatest honor of my professional life. I was telling you the truth at the time, but it is an incredible honor to be back in this new role, and I'm really excited, not only for to be back, but most especially for the future of the society. And when people ask me, well, you come back to the Philosophical Society, why do you want to go back? You just left that place, and the truth is, it is so much fun working with you all and the members. The work the society does is absolutely inspiring, and I cannot wait to work with you all more in the future in a range of new ways in this new role. So thank you all for your trust. I also want to say a little something about Bob Hauser. The Hauser Fest, I know officially starts after I talk, but we had Yoshia before, and Yoshia mentioned what it was like to have Bob as a mentor. I want to talk a little bit about what it's like to have Bob as your boss. Which is very good. So the large majority of my tenure as librarian, Bob was the executive officer, and Bob and I worked on a lot of projects, big and small, easy and difficult. Bob, Linda, and my wife all shared COVID together. But there's going to be a lot of talk about what Bob has accomplished as executive officer, and I want to share something that might not appear in the written record, and that's Bob's generosity. I think one of the defining elements of Bob as executive officer was how much time, his own time, he was willing to invest in the society. And especially I saw that when he engaged with new and young scholars. The library hosts a whole range of programs to help develop early career scholars. We have weekly brown bags, we have manuscript workshops for pre-docs and people working on their first books. And Bob, who had so much to manage as executive officer, would always try and make an attempt to attend each one of these. And even though Bob is a sociologist, a demographer, many of these works were historians far afield from what he knew, he always made great incisive comments. And when there was something that he could, that called on his own scholarship, he'd make an extra point to reach out to those fellows, to have lunch with them, to talk with them, to really invest in the future. And I was Yoshia received that type of support. I did as librarian as well. This book that I'm going to talk about, the very first reader of it was Bob Hauser. And he was very critical and helpful. So I think, when I think about Bob, he is what I think is the highest compliment for a scholar. He is a generous scholar. He is the embodiment of a generous scholar, investing in others. And, the one thing that we can't get more of is time. And Bob is willing to invest his time in the next generation. So I want to thank you, Bob, and I think the society also owes you a debt of gratitude. So thank you, Bob. So speaking of time, there is a clock, if you don't know, that's staring at you, that's telling you how much time you have left to speak, and mine is narrowing. But what's interesting is we're running a little bit ahead of time, and I just told you you can't get more time, but in fact, they gave me 5 extra minutes, if that's okay with all of you. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about this book, which is deeply rooted in the society, in the society's history, in the society's work, and in the society's collections. In fact, we've pulled some treasures here that you all can look at later that really informed the development of this book. So I want to start with talking about how I came to write the book that I did. And the document you're looking at, which is up here, is one of the society's national treasures. It's the Michaux subscription list. By show of hands, how many people here have seen this before? A fair number, but not as many as I thought. So let me tell you what this document says. This is one of my favorite, as a librarian, you get to give these treasures tours, and that was the real fun of the job. You're stuck behind the desk with email 95% of the day, but every once in a while you got to give a treasures tour, and that's what made it really exciting. And this was one of my favorite documents to show. So what you're looking at in that top half, that handwriting is in Thomas Jefferson's hand. It was written in 1793, in the early months of 1793. Jefferson at the time was the vice president of the Philosophical Society and the Secretary of State of the United States, located here in Philadelphia. And what it says, you can see there, is Whereas Andre Michaux, a native of France inhabiting the United States, has undertaken to explore the interior country of North America to the Pacific Ocean. So this is Lewis and Clark before Lewis and Clark, 10 years before Lewis and Clark. And in the middle there, that arrow, it says, the said Philosophical Society will take the proceeds thereof and fund this expedition, this transcontinental expedition. And then beneath that, you have the signatures of, on the top there, George Washington, APS member, $100, also, of course, President of the United States at the time. John Adams, beneath it, Vice President, also APS member, elected 1780, $20. Well, I'll say a little something about that in a second, actually. And then in the middle, you've got Thomas Jefferson, the third president, $50. Beneath him, Hamilton, also $50, would not be outdone by Jefferson, of course. And then on the far side, you have James Madison, right, the fourth president. So this is believed to be the only document to contain the first four presidents' signatures on it. Now, what's really remarkable is that this document itself was only rediscovered in the Society's vaults in 1979 when a high school intern was going through the vaults on a summer project, came across this cache of papers, realized that opening them up was probably above his pay grade, so he walked them over to the librarian's office, who at the time was Whitfield Bell. Whit unfurled this scroll and realized he had a national treasure on his hand. Now, you all laughed at John Adams, so here's a sidebar. He offered $20. Now, I don't mean to say too much negative about Jefferson. You're going to hear a little bit today. I'm warning you. But at least John Adams probably had that $20 to give, right? Jefferson was always in debt. So I told this story all the time in treasure stores, and I always wrapped it up. People would say, so what happened? What happened to this endeavor? And I would summarize what is on our website. Ultimately, the expedition was called off due to diplomatic difficulties with France, which owned much of the territory to be explored. So it kind of just dissipated. Nothing happened. So fast forward to the pandemic, April 2020. If you all remember that period of time, I mean, I know we don't want to remember it, but if you remember April 2020, we're thinking, this is only going to be a couple weeks, maybe a month or so. So the Society decided to host an event in San Francisco in September of 2020, and they asked me to give a talk about the Michaux subscription list. They said, you talk about it so well, why don't you expand on that talk and give a talk to some members, some guests, and so forth. And I thought, this is great. This is an easy pandemic project. I've always wanted to investigate this a little bit. So I started to explore, and I approached this document with 4 questions. Who was Andre Michaux? What is the story of the subscription list? What happened to it? And did it matter? What's its legacy? And the truth is, as we know, September 2020, we were still bound in our houses, so I never gave that 40-minute talk. I ended up writing a 400-page book, and here I am giving a 20-minute talk to you all. So what I want to do is briefly walk us through each one of these questions to share with you some of the things I learned. So first, who was Andre Michaux? Michaux was one of the leading botanists of his generation. He was probably one of the greatest scientific explorers also of his generation, on par, I think, or at least in the league of James Cook and Lewis and Clark, but he's certainly not as well known as either of those or any of those. His name is largely unknown except for those that are in his field of botany and historians of science. This is not an image of Andre Michaux. There is actually no extant image of Andre Michaux, which I think says a lot about how forgotten he is. This is actually an incredible drawing we found in a French botanist papers here in the library, and it's a picture of what a botanist would look like when they're out in the field conducting their research. So even though I didn't know what Michaux looked like, I often had that picture in my mind as I was doing my research. So Michaux, so I'll give you a little bit of his early life story. So Michaux was born outside of Versailles on an area called Sartori. It was a farmland that was technically owned by the king, but he'd lease it out to some of his favorite subjects. And Michaux's family was one of those who was fortunate enough to have that patronage. And so Michaux's early life was working on the family farm, and his father intended for his son to follow in his footsteps. This was a stable, middle class, maybe even upper middle class position in France at the time. This is middle 18th century. And Michaux continues on that path. He takes over the farm. He marries. He has a son. And then tragedy strikes. And this is one of the things that is a defining element of Michaux's life, is that he's often redirected by events outside of his control. And in this case, his wife dies just a few months after the birth of his son. And Michaux was cast completely adrift. He's sent into this deep, dark, depressive abyss. His neighbors, his friends, they all write about it. It's in the record. People are worried that he's going to do something drastic. And it doesn't seem like anything can pull him out of this depression until finally a botanist at Versailles approaches Michaux, who he knows has this farmland, and said, would you experiment with some of these seeds I was just sent? See if you can develop them in your farmland and tell me what you find. And what Michaux found was that this work consumed him, but it also consoled him. And the botanist took him under his wing and mentored him, and soon introduced him to the highest scientist in Paris. He started to study at the Royal Garden in Paris. Then he was sent over to London to study in the botanical gardens in London. He then took a number of apprenticeships through the mountains of France and Spain. And finally, he had his real opportunity to prove himself in 1782 when a diplomatic envoy was heading to the Middle East from France, and the king decided to appoint Michaux the botanist for the expedition. And Michaux spent 3 years traveling through the Middle East, through Persia, up to the Caspian Sea, and then back to France. And he arrives at the court of France laden with all of these treasures. He has plant specimens, he has animals, he has ancient artifacts. He even developed what is believed to be the first French to Persian dictionary to give you a sense of the range of his intellect. And he receives this incredible welcome. All the adulation and acclaim surrounds him. And the French king realizes he has something special on his hands, and he decides to appoint Michaux the royal botanist. Now, for Michaux, this is exactly what he'd been looking for. This is the stable job that his father wanted for him in the farm, but now Michaux sought as a botanist. And what he thought was he's going to have a regular income coming in, and he could pursue botany as he wished, pursue knowledge for its own sake. And so he said to the king, this is great. I just came back from the Middle East. I want to head further east. I know there's a lot more treasures for us to find, things that might be useful to France. And that's where Michaux learned one of his first and important lessons about being a patron of science, receiving patronage. The king said, no, I have much different ideas for you. Instead of heading east, you have to head west, across the Atlantic to the United States. Michaux reluctantly realizes that he has to be loyal to France, follows these orders, and arrives in the United States. Now, the king did this for very important strategic reasons. France, there were two key reasons. First off, France had just fought about 30 years of continuous warfare, beginning first with what we sometimes call the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, and then supporting the American cause during the American Revolution. So France's force had largely been depleted to support their military. And so the king said to Michaux, your number one priority is find sturdy oaks that you can send across the Atlantic and replenish French forests. The second thing he says is, the eastern North America had been controlled by the British. So French science had largely been inaccessible to French science. So he says, try and find some crops that might be imported and transform French agriculture. And so Michaux was sent over there to do these two things. He arrives in New York City. He establishes 2 botanical gardens, one in New Jersey and another in Charleston, South Carolina. And pretty soon he is completely enthralled with America, and he gives up any wish of going back east. He spends almost 10 years in North America. He discovers over 1,000 new species of plants. He ships across the Atlantic Ocean 50 to 60,000 living specimens back to the French botanical gardens. And you can get some sense of the extent of his travels in North America. He went as far as the Hudson Bay, as far south as Florida, and as far west as the Mississippi River. Now, and everything went swimmingly for Michaux. He was excited. He was receiving funds from the king. He could do basically anything he wanted, so long as he sent specimens back to France. But then, once again, Michaux was completely redirected by events outside of his control. The French Revolution happens. Michaux's funder is deposed, and so his funds begin to dry up. And Michaux begins to struggle with finances. And by 1792, he's on the verge of bankruptcy. And he's trying to figure out what to do. And he realizes, as the royal botanist, probably the safest place for him is outside of Paris. And so he strikes up on this idea. He sees all this area that he's covered, and he realizes there's this great, vast expanse west that remains unexplored by European scientists. And he realizes if he does this transcontinental trek, he will establish himself in the pantheon of great scientific explorers. And he realizes that in America, if there's one place that might support this type of expedition, it's in Philadelphia, and it's the American Philosophical Society. So he travels to Philadelphia in December 1792. He meets with a group of APS members. We have his journals in our library, and his account of meeting with the Philosophical Society is over in this vitrine over here. He meets with Benjamin Smith Barton. He meets with William Bartram, who's one of his closest friends. They hear this idea, and they say, yes, this is exactly what we've been trying to do. As a matter of fact, a year earlier, the APS had tried to do this very expedition, but they couldn't find anybody willing to do it. And they say, the person you need to talk to is Thomas Jefferson. He is the connector between government and science, and he's also a great connector to raise the money to support your expedition. So Michaux meets with Jefferson. He pitches him on his idea, and Jefferson, who had been dreaming about this expedition since it's at least 1783, since in 1783 he tried to recruit George Rogers Clark to do this exact expedition, but he failed to raise the money. So he meets Michaux. He hears all about Michaux's travels, and he realizes, yes, I've got my guy. And so he decides to raise money to support this expedition. This is probably one of the Society's first and one of the largest fundraising initiatives in the early Republic. The Society successfully raises the equivalent of $1.75 million. It's a mix of people in government and also APS members. And so everything is going swimmingly. They raised the money. They're preparing for their expedition. And then Jefferson says to Michaux, you know, we've talked a lot about raising the money and what you need for this expedition, but we haven't actually talked about what you're going to do on this expedition. And he points out to this little clause in the subscription list that he's going to go to the Pacific Ocean or in such other direction as shall be advised by the American Philosophical Society. So Jefferson and the American Philosophical Society say, well, we've raised this money. Michaux, we get to tell you what you should do on this expedition. And the Society does what it often does, but both back then and today. It decided to create a committee. Everybody gets that that's here. To come up with the instructions for André Michaux's expedition. And they appoint 6 APS members, 3 of whom were elected in 1768. That's kind of the first crop of revolutionary scientists. And then 3 who are more recent members, like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, and Caspar Wistar. And they sit down, and this is also in our collection. These are the instructions that were given to André Michaux. They're in Thomas Jefferson's hand. And these are the things that they tell Michaux should be his priorities. First off, you should find the fastest route to the Pacific Ocean. Why? Because this is in the commercial interest of the United States. It's like finding the Northwest Passage. They just want to find how quickly can we reach the Pacific and those markets. Second, we want you to look for some animals. Our number 1 priority is a woolly mammoth. And then, if you can, a North American llama. Now, I don't really have time to tell you why they chose those, but it's really interesting and it's really important to the history of science in this period and also our country's history. What I will say is that they gave this to Michaux, and as soon as Michaux sees these, remember, he's a botanist, he's loyal to France, and his real desire in life is just to pursue botany for its own sake, not to have any boss. It's kind of like all of ours. Sorry, Roger. So the APS and Michaux get in these extended negotiations. They come to loggerheads. They cannot agree on the terms of the instructions. It's a total standstill, and we actually have a letter from Michaux expressing his disdain at these instructions here. So Michaux was stuck in Philadelphia. Nothing seems to be happening with the APS. And then once again, Michaux is completely redirected by events outside of his control when this gentleman arrives. Can anybody identify him? Mary Beth Norton, I knew, I was relying on you. Who is he?
Citizen Genet.
Yes, Citizen Genet, Edmond Genet. He is the first representative of the French revolutionary government to come to the United States. He arrives to Philadelphia to both fanfare and disdain. Those that support the French Revolution, this is a great political divide in the early republic. Do you support the French Revolution as a continuation of the American Revolution, or do you think it's a deviation from? And those who supported the French Revolution welcomed Genet. Genet arrived with all these secret instructions and orders that he was to follow, one of which was to mobilize an insurrection in Kentucky. Yeah. Now, you laugh, but wait till you hear what happens. So the reason Genet had these instructions is because the French were then locked in battle with Great Britain and Spain over the future of Europe. Were monarchies going to fall to this French revolutionary fervor, or could monarchies defend their traditions? Now, what the French had heard is that there are these group of these frontiersmen who are angry with their federal government in the East. It ignores their interest. It's just a bunch of elitists and capitalists in the East. And they're willing to renounce their allegiance to the United States, swear their allegiance to the French Revolution, and seize Spanish Louisiana and turn it into an independent republic aligned with France. And the French, they think that they have a real shot at doing this. And if they succeed, it will not only upend geopolitics in North America, they hope it might force the Washington administration, who's been trying to maintain neutrality, to side with the French in their revolution. And so Genet arrives in Philadelphia, and there's this botanist who's sitting around with nothing to do, who also, he learns, is a really great explorer. And he realizes, just like Jefferson did, I've got my man. And so he meets with Michaux, and he says, Andre, I want you to travel out to Kentucky. I want you to travel under the guise of science, pretend you're conducting these botanical experiments, but I really want you to meet with George Rogers Clark, that same person Jefferson had asked to do this expedition, who has indicated that he's willing to lead this insurrection, this invasion of Spanish Louisiana. And so Michaux is reluctant, but he is nonetheless loyal and agrees to do so. So Genet and Michaux start plotting how they're going to do this. They start acquiring arms that Michaux is secretly going to carry out amongst all of his botanical supplies. But Genet's worried. He says that, a Frenchman going out there, people might be suspicious about him. How can I get rid of people's suspicions? And that's where he realizes there's Thomas Jefferson. All right, Jefferson is a great supporter of the French Revolution. He's frustrated with the Washington administration. And Genet and Jefferson had become very quick friends when Genet arrived in Philadelphia. In fact, Genet was one of Jefferson's most frequent correspondents. They socialized all the time. And so Genet said, I think Jefferson might help us in this. Remember, Jefferson's the Secretary of State. So Genet goes out to Jefferson's house on July the 5th in West Philadelphia. And this is Jefferson's handwritten account of what transpired in that meeting. And you can see that Genet called on him, and Edmund Genet told the Secretary of State this entire plot, what he planned to do. And then, at the end, he said, Thomas, can I ask you for a favor as a friend? Will you write a letter of introduction for Andre Michaux and say that he's just out there doing botany and you don't have to worry about anything? And what does the Secretary of State do? He writes that letter of introduction. You can see that in the last line. So to put this in context, this is like the Secretary of State today knowing about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and not only deciding to do nothing, but kind of helping them. So what happens? Michaux travels out west with this passport from the Secretary of State. He meets with George Rogers Clark, who agrees to mobilize this invasion of Spanish Louisiana. He calls on all of his former generals and colonels. And in Kentucky, they mobilize over 2,000 angry frontiersmen. They create their own uniforms. They begin mustering. They start to build boats. They have a whole flotilla of boats because they plan to go down the Mississippi River in them. And there are even reports of iron forges burning brighter because they're smelting more cannons for the invasion. So everything seems to be going as planned for the French. But then a Spanish spy informs the Washington administration of what's going on. Now, mind you, the Secretary of State has known this whole time, right? As soon as Washington finds out, it creates a major crisis for him, both constitutional and foreign policy. For constitutional, it's a question of what authority does the executive officer actually have? Can he suppress this type of action by citizens? And for foreign policy, he knows if this happens, it could completely shatter not just the foreign policy of the United States, but the foundations, the fragile foundations of this republic. So Washington decides to assert executive authority in a way that he previously had been hesitant to doing. He authorizes the U.S. military to use force to suppress this invasion if necessary, but he also sends out agents and other representatives to tell the Kentucky frontiersmen that what they're doing is illegal and they have to stand down. And the anticlimactic end to the story, which always was a challenge for me as a writer, is that it all just kind of dissipates with that because of Washington's decision to exert executive authority in this way. So, I want to end. I see my time is now coming to a close with two final thoughts, and that's that fourth question. So, did it matter? Did this matter? Because the rebellion just dissipates. And I want to talk about in the last couple of minutes two of the legacies that I think are left here. The first is in the history of the United States. You can see here a Constitution. This is, if you can read it well enough, this is Benjamin Franklin's copy of the Constitution with his annotations on the side. That is also held in our library across the street. And one of the legacies that was left was after everything kind of settled down, those in the federal government that started talking about, well, how do we deal with this type of situation? What is the right authority of the federal government? And they heard the arguments from those in Kentucky, because those in Kentucky who were trying to undertake this action, they had to justify what they were doing. And those in Kentucky made an argument, and it was prominent on the frontier, that citizenship, this new idea of citizenship, everybody before had been subject to a king, that citizenship ended at the country's borders. So you may be an American citizen, but as soon as you travel into another country, you are no longer bound by its policies, by its laws. You are not obligated to it at all. And so what those in Kentucky said, and we have those arguments, is as soon as we cross the Mississippi River, we're just independent citizens of the world who can do whatever we want, and whatever we do will not reflect back on the United States. Now, Washington did not agree with this, because he knew that independent citizens like that could completely undermine federal government policy in the country itself. So he, with Congress, which at this time is divided, it's a highly partisan environment, this is something they agree on, they say we need to pass a law that clarifies what citizenship means, what its limits are, what its obligations are. And so in 1795, they pass a law directly as a result of this near rebellion to ensure that something like this would not happen again. And if it did, the federal government did have the authority to suppress it. And this, for me, what this reminds me of is the work of a historian. Never did I think when I started my research in this one document to give a 40-minute talk in San Francisco that my own personal expedition during the pandemic, living vicariously through Michaux, would bring me to such an elemental, fundamental part of the nation's early history, the very idea of citizenship and what it meant. And that also reminds me of how many more stories are waiting to be told in the collections in our library. We have 14 million pages of manuscripts, and if one document could tell this story, just think about all the stories waiting to be told in a library. So, did I lose my last slide, Jeremy? Oh, no, great. So the last thought I want to leave you on is the legacies here at the APS. And I was having a conversation with Governor Wolf before this talk, and he said to me, "Oh, Michaux, do you know there's Michaux State Forest?" And I said, "Yes, and wait till you hear its story." I don't know if we've got the time, but I'll try. Michaux State Forest, okay? What's the story of Michaux State Forest? André Michaux eventually returns to France. He ends up dying in Madagascar. His son, Francois-André Michaux, follows in his footsteps. He becomes a botanist, also becomes a member of the American Philosophical Society. When Francois-André Michaux dies, he has no heirs. He leaves his entire fortune to the American Philosophical Society. The APS receives it in 1870, and they say, what is a pressing problem that we can try and address today? And in the 1870s, the deforestation of the Pennsylvania countryside was a pressing concern. This is the early days of the conservation movement. And so the APS decided to take these funds and hire a lecturer who would travel around the state of Pennsylvania advocating for the need to conserve our forests. And it's in the historic record that he started talking with a small audience of 10 who didn't want to hear this and they weren't interested, and he left with an audience of 300. And after several years, the state decided to create the first Department of Forestry, and they appointed him as its first director. And in recognition for the society's support that he had given to the conservation, he named the first forest Michaux State Forest. And so that's the story of Michaux State Forest, rooted in the APS's own history, not well known. The other legacy, I think, is that this spirit that animated the society to support Michaux really has animated it through its entire existence. The society has always pushed the boundaries of knowledge, wherever that may be. You can see here all of the expeditions that it supported in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it was an innovator in giving out independent research grants to individuals to conduct research. The Franklin Grants and the Phillips Fund are two of our oldest grants. And it continues in the 21st century. The Society was one of the first places to fund research in astrobiology, pushing us into that next frontier. And so when I think about the Philosophical Society, when I think about this legacy, it's not just about the Society's past, it's also about its present and how vital the Society continues to be today. And it's also one of the reasons I'm so excited to return here. Thank you. And according to the clock, I didn't go that long, so. Great. Any questions?
What is the law or legislation that comes out of the XYZ affair for the provenance of citizenship?
Yeah, what's the relationship between the two? Yeah, I don't know a good answer to that. I often get asked about the Burr conspiracy. So the XYZ affair, it's related. It's about what individuals can do representing the United States abroad. They're related, but they're separate laws. I have not thought about that or explored that. The Burr conspiracy, of course, is what people ask me a lot about. And in fact, this Genet affair and the conspiracy is just part of a pattern that happens in the Kentucky in which there are these near rebellions and attempts to create independent states throughout the early history of the United States. Yep. Hey, Ellen.
Patrick, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Ellen Cohn, Franklin Papers at Yale. I didn't know any of this. It's just totally amazing. But what I associate Michaux with is, if I'm not mistaken, a 3-volume set of trees of North America. So here during your talk, I was feeling very sorry for him because he never got a chance to botanize. But when did he do that work?
So Michaux, this is the story of kind of a deeper story of Michaux. Michaux, after this conspiracy fails, Thomas Jefferson protects Michaux. He's never outed as being implicated at all in this plot. And so Michaux returns to Charleston. Eventually, he continues to lobby for support to do this transcontinental expedition. And all of his friends, especially those in Philadelphia at the APS, they say to him, Andre, if you undertake this expedition, you should do it, but you're probably not going to return. You're probably going to die. And all the work that you've done thus far will be lost to posterity. So what you need to do is go back to France, just publish what you've done, and then come back to America, and we'll support you in your expedition. So Michaux goes back to France, and you can see it, and his friends in France write about it. This is in their correspondence, their memories of him, is that he couldn't publish. He just loved to be in the field conducting work. So he struggles to publish the volumes on oaks in this Silva of North America. He does both two works, one on oaks, which is inspired by this expedition, and another on the Silva. And so he published those. One of those is done posthumously. And then he undertakes an expedition to Madagascar, where he dies. So, yeah. Great. Yeah.
So, why don't you explain why you have the painting of the excavation of the mastodon as part of that display?
Yeah. Well, actually, Bob, you're giving me a chance to talk about the llama and the mammoth. One of Jefferson's obsessions, as many of you probably know, was the mammoth, discovering the mammoth. And the idea behind the mammoth, and trust me, this will get to that dig, there was this transatlantic debate going on over the environment in North America. There was a French scientist who argued that all the plants and animals in North America were weaker than those in Europe. And the idea was that the environment in North America caused things to degenerate. Now, Jefferson, who loved so much about France, also was highly critical of France and thought that's where there's decadence and luxury and decay. And that America was pure, and that's where, things are going to grow. And obviously, this commentary on the environment and the plants and animals was also one on civilization. And so Jefferson was dedicated to trying to find a mammoth, because there were all these fossils that started arriving in Philadelphia from people doing things in the Mississippi River area. And he figured, if I find a mammoth, I'll be able to disprove this theory, because the idea of extinction was not very prominent this time. So he really wanted to discover the mammoth. This then became a major initiative of the Philosophical Society. And what you're seeing in this, what you're seeing in that drawing that Bob was referencing was the APS funding the first successful excavation of a mastodon in the United States by Charles Wilson Peale outside of Newburgh, New York. And the story in the llama is interesting because what's going on there, this is, again, early United States kind of politics. The United States, it declared itself independent from Great Britain, but yet it still felt very dependent on Great Britain, especially economically. And they had to import a lot of wool and woolen goods. They had to import sheep from Europe. And they had heard, the Philosophical Society had heard of a llama that roamed in the Rocky Mountains. And they figured in the same vein that, hey, if we can find a llama with wool that's natural to North America, then that must be better wool than Europe. So they really wanted Michaux to find it. So I see that we're at time now. I just want to point out, for those of you, we're going into a break. There are refreshments in the front and also in the back, and treasures here at the front. We have Michaux's journals that came to us. We have the subscription list. And we also have Thomas Jefferson's instructions to Michaux over here. So thank you all again.